ตามพระจินดา
Thank you very much. And great talk, Fred. I enjoyed that. I'm sort of doing the opposite end of this talk from what he did. I'm talking about the good bacteria more than the bad ones and how they are benefiting us. So he keeps us out of trouble, and if you only listen to me, you could get in trouble, I guess. So let's get started because fermented foods and microorganisms in general are very important to human health. And we'll talk about just why that is. Okay. Okay, there we go. But first of all, we'll talk about a little bit of terminology just for the students and people here who may not know some of the terms that I use. A probiotic is a beneficial microorganism, and it can be any number of them, usually bacteria and yeast, however. A prebiotic is not an organism at all, but something that the beneficial bacteria will eat, usually. That feeds the probiotics and promotes the growth of the uh, probiotics. A symbiotic is a combination of the two. And then a postbiotic is kind of a new terminology, and it's appeared in the literature about 20 or 30 papers now. And those are products of the bacteria that are beneficial. The bacteria itself may be dead, but they've left behind molecules and things that are beneficial to people. So that's actually the case. Give you an example of that. When you eat Jeonju soup, there's no longer any live bacteria in it. That stuff's been boiled and boiled and boiled. But there's a lot of beneficial things made by those bacteria that made the Jeonju that are still there and benefit health. So those are postbiotics. Symbiosis is where the two organisms can benefit each other. That's an example is humans and their beneficial bacteria each work together. Commensalism are forms of life that live together without much effect on each other. And amphibiosis is where two life forms live together that may harm or help each other depending on the conditions. And that happens quite a lot, actually. And then just the units, probably most of you know that we use colony forming units when we're describing how many bacteria are present or other microbes. Now, one little advertisement before we go on. This is a new book, Korean Functional Foods, that has just come out this year. And it's got a lot of information on fermented foods and bacteria. In fact, probably 2/3 of the book is on fermented foods. And it turns out, I didn't know it until I got my copy recently, I'm the only author in there that's not Korean. But many people here have authored parts of the book. Dr. Cha wrote a chapter, and many more people here did. But very good book, just off the press. Now, people from long, long ago were aware that something was happening to food that made it go bad. They had no idea back in these very, very prehistoric times, but they knew that if they cooked food, they froze it, they smoked it, they dried it, it would keep longer. Yeah, and even a little bit later, they learned fermenting helped. uh, but that was probably not the earliest people. We don't really know when fermentation began. It goes back beyond written history. And so some of the earliest writings in the world described fermentation of food. But we have to assume that even before that, it was being done to some extent. So we don't know when it really started. However, I sort of imagine in my own mind that a long, long ago, there was a lonely traveler who found some cabbage and maybe some beans and other things along the trail, sat down and enjoyed a great meal and had leftovers. So what did he do? He wrapped it up in some cloth or whatever material he had, probably a skin, scooped out a little hole in the ground, buried it, put a rock over it, and came back later to retrieve it. Unfortunately, he came back later than he intended to and was concerned that it might have gone bad. Instead, he found that actually it had a rather pleasant taste to it. So he ate it. And best of all, he didn't get sick. So he learned then that from by accident that letting the food ferment under certain conditions would allow him to preserve the food. Not long after that, he went back to his village and they were all fermenting foods. So that was probably a scenario that might have happened. And it might have happened right out here around us. Now, what he may have made from my description would have been essentially uh, kimchi. Kimchi is a probiotic food, has live bacteria. It's a prebiotic, very rich in fibers. And your dietary fibers are your best prebiotics. It's also symbiotic since it has both, but it's also a postbiotic because we know that as kimchi ferments, the earlier bacteria start dying off, leaving behind the materials they produced, and new ones kind of take over and proceed. So we have a food here that has all of these kinds of effects. And we find that not only kimchi here in Korea, but almost simultaneously, it seems like, around the world, various fermented foods were being produced. And this is just a slide that looks at that very generally, but you can see pretty much the whole earth has their own unique fermented foods. Probably wine was the first one. Because that's about the earliest records we have that I've been able to find of actual fermented foods were wines. So that was a very early one. And there's still wines from ancient Greece that they dig up, well, they bring up from the bottom of the Mediterranean that have survived and are safe after thousands of years. So it has worked very well as a preservative. Now, fast forward a little bit. The really first probiotic foods where we actually knew the microorganisms came about 100 years ago. Eli Meshnikov was postulated that bacteria in yogurt might be responsible for the long lifespan of Bulgarian peasants. Now, he gave a talk about that in Paris, and suddenly he was a very famous researcher. There was just a run on yogurt everywhere. He started a frantic demand for yogurt in Paris, and nobody could keep up. But from that time on, it became known as a health benefiting food. And today it's widely accepted that a strong population of beneficial bacteria is beneficial for health. But this was a new concept in his day. But do they really prevent serious disease? Well, I was at experimental biology about 3 years ago, and Dr. O'Keefe was just telling about some research he did. It turns out that African Americans have a very high incidence of colon cancer. However, the same Africans still in Africa, the same tribes, have a very low incidence of colon cancer. And he was wondering why that might be. Well, he decided to switch their diets. And he gave the Africans diets with lots of meat, high fat, Western type diet. Now, that African tribe that was matched to the Americans ate mostly corn, a corn that was coarsely ground, uh, cooked into a mush, and eaten. And that was their staple food. That was most of what they ate. Turns out that as they did biopsies in the colon, that the incidence of precancerous polyps and markers of precancer were completely switched in the two groups. The, they ended the experiments early on because you don't want to give a bunch of uh, Africans cancer in your studies. But it was so clear, and he has all the histology slides and everything available at the meeting. But it was very, very clear that there was a big difference in the two diets and their effect on the development of colon cancer. Now, one of the bacteria that was probably responsible for that, and there were many of them that were different in the groups, was one called Akkermansia municiphala, an interesting bacterium, actually. Um, Akkermansia seems to be one of the major bacteria that was decreased um, by the high meat diet. It's depleted in obesity or increase in the high meat diet. It is depleted in obese people and is associated with kind of a leaky gut syndrome. It actually eats mucin in the gut as its main food source. It allows it to be made. Uh, it allows more mucin to be made and maintains the quality of the mucin. However, too much is also bad because although there's many benefits to having a good population of Akkermansia, if it eats too much mucin, you get other problems. So people with ulcerative colitis uh, actually have very high levels of this bacteria in the gut. So here we find that people who have the right amount uh, do very well. People with too little are more likely to become obese, and they've actually been able to reverse obesity by giving them that bacteria. They become diabetic. However, if they get too much of that bacteria, then they develop colon problems. So this is an interesting amphibiosis situation where this particular bacteria can be good, bad, or just right, depending on how much you have. And I think that's the real story for just about all bacteria in the gut and in health, with a few exceptions of the really nasty ones. And I'm going to keep moving here a little bit. Inflammatory bowel disease, as it turns out, is something that's quite new. I saw this picture, let's go back. This slide was last year's experimental American Nutrition Society meeting. Until 1960, inflammatory bowel diseases essentially didn't exist. And why that is, we're not quite sure. But it has something to do with gut bacteria and quite possibly with overuse of antibiotics is what's speculated. So getting these bacteria out of balance, but we'll keep moving here. Okay. Another example of this kind of situation is Heliobacter pylori. Another bacteria we usually think of being very bad because it is the bacteria that causes ulcers in the stomach. It's nasty, but they can get rid of it completely. Some of these very powerful antibiotics like Cipro will completely wipe out the population of H. pylori. It'll be gone. H. pylori is kind of a unique bacteria in that there's not animal vectors that you get it from. It's actually transmitted human to human. So you can wipe out the bacteria and probably never get it again. However, Martin Blazier, who wrote the book Missing Microbes, very good researcher, CDC for many years, actually got ulcers, was treated, wiped out the H. pylori, none left in his gut, and ulcers went away. But he observed that he also then developed gastric esophageal reflux disease. So he had acid reflux disease after that, which he'd never had before. So he started looking at data and found that it turns out people with acid reflux are twice as likely to not have H. pylori in their stomach. So there again, it's great to have the H. pylori very low so you don't get ulcers. But if you completely get rid of it, you're going to develop other problems. Now, where do we get the bacteria to start with? Well, there again, just like with H. pylori, it's a human transmitted thing. And at birth, we have just about no bacteria at all in our intestinal tract. So it's like a desert out there. Immediately after birth, you see a little bit of a population suddenly popping up. Not too much, but a little bit. You know, by the time we get to preschool, we got a city here full of bacteria through the gut. Actually, it's only about 2 years old. You have a huge population of bacteria in your intestinal tract. And then we take antibiotics, whoop, and here we are, not really quite that bad. That's an exaggeration. But we can wipe them all out with antibiotics, or a lot of them. And sometimes we do wipe out entire populations of a bacteria. They do that intentionally with H. pylori, and this is just showing you a growth curve because these things can recover if they're not completely gone very quickly. And we don't need to go over that too much. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the microorganisms here, and I'm saying bacteria, but not really. Up here at the top, there are actually three domains of life forms in the gut. All three that exist, actually. We have archaea, which are the most primitive, people say, of the microorganisms. Bacteria in the middle here, and then eukarya. We have all of those in our gut. Now, plants and animals, the fungi and protista are the bacteria, the microorganisms we're most likely to see in our gut and our intestinal tract. But the archaea over here are fascinating to me. They're really unusual little creatures. They're actually closer related to eukaryotes, us, than are the bacteria. But they have unique metabolic characteristics. And we don't know a lot about them and how they affect us. These are the kind of creatures we find, heat vents, hot springs and mud baths in Yellowstone. Very, very harsh conditions. Thermal vents in the ocean have the archaea. These are the microorganisms that can eat plastic in the ocean and have been postulated to maybe be in a way of cleaning up pollution. They can eat petroleum from soils and oil spills. Now, it's a very slow process, but they can do amazing things. And they're in our bacteria, part of our microbial population in our gut as well. And I really am fascinated by these creatures, so to speak, and what they're doing and how they might protect us. But most of the time, we're looking at this middle area here, the bacteria. And we can see that most of the time, when we're talking about gut bacteria, we break them down into these categories by phyla. By far, the majority of bacteria in our gut are actinobacteria, Firmicutes, and Bacteroides. Those are the major categories of bacteria. Although we can go on down the line, the class, order, and family, to the genus Lactobacillus, to Acidophilus, and we go as far as strains, because strains are actually almost as important as species in some cases. Like Dr. Bright was talking about E. coli. Actually, there are E. coli that are fairly beneficial. They can produce vitamin K, they can produce vitamin B12. Unfortunately, we can't absorb the vitamin B12 that's produced in the gut, but that's another story. But they can do a lot of good things. Some of them can. Some of them are just, very, very deadly. And so we usually try to eliminate all E. coli from foods just because that sort of covers the bases. But when you're looking at strains of bacteria, you really find that they're almost as different as different species. Well, how do the gut microbes actually benefit humans? Well, there's a number of ways. They produce short-chain fatty acids, acetate, butyrate, propionate. These are foods for the gut cells themselves. So these are necessary for having a healthy intestinal tract. They change bioactive compounds in food to make them more effective. And an example of that is equal being produced from the soy isoflavone diadzine. And I'll have a paper coming out about that and how it benefits women and menopausal symptoms early next year in the Journal of Medicinal Food. They also produce immune factors and can improve immune tolerance to antigens. Can make some essential nutrients, as we mentioned. They can actually produce neurotransmitters that are taken up into circulation and go to the brain. They can help with maintaining body weight, with benefits for cardiovascular health and glucose regulation. All these things can be done and very profoundly in the gut. And there's just an amazing amount of research being published in top journals on these topics right now. Now we'll talk about a couple of bacteria that are especially beneficial and the ones that we see commonly used for probiotics. But they're also in foods. Lactobacillus acidophilus is probably the most studied bacteria of all the probiotics. And it, again, was studied by, spelled his name wrong there, but Meshnikov. It's a gram-positive anaerobe, but it does tolerate some oxygen. It's not really classified as a facultative anaerobe, but it is somewhat tolerant. And it turns out that we have acidophilus from pretty much our throat area all the way through our intestinal tract to the rectum. However, it is probably the most important bacteria in the small intestine. Like most good bacteria, it probably helps reduce inflammation by encouraging T regulatory cells, their growth, to produce IL-10. It also produces bacteriocins that can kill other bacteria. Often they're specific for harmful bacteria. And the well-researched benefits of acidophilus include blood pressure and cholesterol lowering, fighting bacterial and fungal infections, improvement in many conditions infants experience because they become inoculated with that very early on. Has nutritional benefits, helps reduce allergy severity, and helps digestive conditions. So it's very beneficial, and you'll see it in a lot of yogurts, probiotic products, and other places. Very common one and very beneficial. The one that's probably most, this one's less common, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to run on past it. This one, Bifida Bacteria, is the most common probiotic bacteria in the large intestine, in the colon. It's a gram-positive anaerobe for sure, and one of the most common probiotic bacteria in the healthy colon. Most found mostly in the colon, lower intestine. It doesn't really exist much in the small intestine. Fructooligosaccharides or inulin is a great food for it, and that's why we put that in a lot of prebiotic supplements. It has many benefits. It is great for helping to normalize the intestinal flora overall. It does not survive in the stomach acid well, so it's important to have a delivery system that helps it get there. And we have special capsules we can take that get through the stomach before they dissolve. But it acts as an immunomodulator, lowers cholesterol again, reduces intolerance to foodborne allergies, restores normal intestinal flora, produces nutrients that are beneficial, including folic acid, reduces liver toxins, improves mineral absorption. So it does a lot of wonderful things for us. And to sort of wrap it up, the gut microbiome develops and changes throughout the lifespan. One of the things that people are really looking at right now, after about the age of 60, we begin to lose microbial diversity in the human gut. Why, we don't really know, because there's nothing that really seems to trigger it that we know of. But it's an age-related thing that just happens. And maintaining the diversity of the microbes in the gut appears to be very important to maintaining health. So that's something that eating the fermented foods, getting more and more inoculation of these fermented foods may help to prevent. I can't say that it does for sure because I haven't seen the study done on that. I'm not sure one has been. But it seems likely that that would be a helpful thing, particularly as people age, to try to get that microbial diversity up, especially traditionally fermented foods, because they're more likely to have small amounts of a more diverse bacterial population, whereas those grown in very controlled conditions usually are inoculated with one or two bacteria or a few more, but only those. So that's one of the pitfalls of the modern processing of fermented foods. Most microbes should not really be considered good or bad. They just need to be in balance. And we saw two examples today of how a microbe can be good and bad simultaneously, depending on the conditions. Diet is actually the greatest determinant of an individual's microbiome. We have about 90,000 kilograms of food that go through our gut during our lifetime. It's a lot, and over a lifetime we eat a lot of food, and it carries a lot of nutrients that can benefit or harm our intestinal microbiota. So we need to think about what all that material is as we eat it. However, diet, disease, medications, etc., can also affect this. There's a lot of things that we can do. Medications in particular can really disrupt the human microbiome. Plant-based diets are the ideal way to establish a healthy microbiome, and this has been shown over and over. There's many downsides to a meat diet or a diet rich in meat to the intestinal bacteria. It throws it out of balance very quickly. And a traditional Korean diet is just about optimal for that because it was a diet based on rice, vegetables, with just small amounts of meat added, almost more as seasonings. As Koreans have gotten wealthier, they can buy a lot more meat, and the diet has changed in a way that's probably not healthy for your gut. Uh, Probiotics help, especially if a bacterial species has been eradicated. You can put it back, you can restore that bacteria. Now, however, if you're eating a diet that does not encourage the growth of that bacteria, you're probably wasting your money to do it because it's hard to get it reestablished if you don't have a diet that will increase the proliferation of that particular bacteria. But I think the main message today is eating a diet rich in yeah, rich in microbes from fermentation. These are things that will help us have a healthy intestinal tract, and if we have a healthy intestinal tract, it goes a long ways for being healthy overall. Thank you.
Thank you, 팀장. 그 프로바이오틱스나 프로비오틱스 같은 미생물을 활용한 제품에 대해서 많은 말씀을 주시고, I think you already more slide, last slide.
Oh,
Oh,
I didn't. Yeah, I left that slide off with a couple of products that I make, but I do make some probiotics.
질문 있으시면 특히 오늘 업체에서도 많이 오셨는데요. 미국에 뭐 진출하시고 싶은 상품이 있으시면 적극적으로 발표해 주시면 감사할 것 같아요.
Yes, go for it.
I'm kind of intrigued by something you said about Helicobacter pylori.
Okay.
You mentioned that if you have none of it, it leads to acid reflux.
Yeah, it does.
Do you know, is there much known about the mechanism by which Helicobacter pylori in small amounts prevents acid reflux?
You know, I don't know that there is. Martin Blaser, who did that work and wrote about it in a book for the general public that I read, really started looking. He does a lot of epidemiological type things and started really looking at the data and the associations and found that there was a strong link for people, who do not have the bacteria and the acid reflux. But he did not put in the book a mechanism. I'm not sure if he did say anything about it, it was more speculative. I don't think there's the data to show a mechanism available yet. But yeah, that is intriguing.
헬리코박터가 너무 많으면 유형 또는 유형까지도 걸리지만 헬리코박터가 전혀 없으니까 또 역류증이 생긴다고 발표하시니까 이 선생님께서 헬리코가 없을 때 역류증을 이렇게 막는다는 데이터도 있는데 어떻게 생각하냐고 하니까 여러 가지 역학조사나 이런 걸 통해서 발표한 그것을 얘기했다고 한 것 같아요. 헬리코박터는 좀 문제가 있죠, 우리나라에서도.
Any other questions? Okay, very good. I enjoyed it. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.